Welcome back to Eye on Iowa. I'm Sarah Mueller, a reporter with Forbes, and today I am joined by Professor Tim Hagle with the University of Iowa. Thank you so much for joining me because we have less than 2 weeks until the Iowa caucuses. Just to get started, what do you think the overall kind of vibe is here in Iowa? What are you seeing right now from the candidates?
Well, we're in that final sprint to the finish, and so the candidates are in Iowa, and we're seeing a variety of town halls and rallies and other events that are going on. Some of these are going to be broadcast through various media sources, CNN holding a debate next week, of course, and some town halls tonight, I think. And Trump's doing some events, a lot more than he's used to doing, again, in this final push. So it's all a matter of still identifying some supporters that may be out there and persuading others, but also making sure that your supporters know where their caucus is and to get them out to it on Monday night, January 15th.
I think that's interesting because I've noticed that Donald Trump's events lately have been kind of informative. They're about trying to get people to actually show up to caucus and not just, say I'm supporting Trump, because they think maybe he's going to get the GOP nomination, but actually saying, hey, you need to show up and caucus for him too. So that's been kind of an interesting trend. Now, just getting into the Democrats really quick, I want to talk about their process because they've changed a bunch of things kind of last minute. Can you kind of talk us through what Democratic process that they're going to go through that's different than the Republicans?
Well, keep in mind that for the Democrats, that they have an incumbent this particular cycle. And so we normally wouldn't see much action for them, even if they were using the traditional caucus procedures. But what they decided to do, because the Democratic National Committee decided they didn't want Iowa to be one of the early states, and the Iowa Democrats were trying to find ways around that, were unsuccessful, and decided to basically try to go along with as much as what the DNC wanted as possible. And for one of the things that that meant was that they were no longer going to hold a traditional in-person caucus. Now, by state law, they do have to caucus, but only for the party business. So it means electing delegates to the county convention, members of the county central committee. But that's just the party business. In terms of the presidential preference poll of some sort, the Democrats are going to use a mail-in ballot. And that procedure has already started. People can request the ballots now, and they'll be mailed out later. And then eventually they'll be tallied up, and the results will be announced. I believe it's Super Tuesday, probably late that evening, something along those lines. So basically, as far as Democrats are concerned, Iowa is no longer part of the early voting states and will basically be lost in the mix of the other Super Tuesday states.
Obviously, we are known for our untraditional way of caucusing for the Democrats, kind of going into a room and going to different parts of the room to caucus for different candidates. And this year, we're kind of doing away with that to do this mail in option. Do you think we'll go back to that original concept in the future?
My guess is probably not, for a couple of reasons. One is simply that one of the emphasis or points of emphasis for the Democrats was they wanted to allow for some type of absentee or early voting. So it was more like a primary. Well, the closer it got to a primary, one of the concerns that the Democrats had was that it would maybe then run afoul of the New Hampshire law, which New Hampshire law indicates that they are the first primary. So the reason that Iowa was able to go ahead of them for all these years was that we were a caucus rather than a primary. And even though the Republicans in their caucuses, they basically just have a vote and announce results, and that's it. They go on to party business. And that didn't seem to be a problem. Democrats didn't want to do it that way. So you had this different procedure that was fairly involved. And the problem with that, and this is sort of the second aspect of this, is that aside from having to show up, is that it took a long time to do this. And for a lot of the precincts that were very crowded, particularly say in the county where I'm at, Johnson County, which is as a heavily Democratic in terms of voter registration, you had a lot of heavy turnout in the caucus precincts, and also a lot of people that would maybe be no party voters, which is what we call the independents here in Iowa, that they would, take time in terms of getting them registered. And so the process was very involved and very long, and often took much longer than people really wanted to spend on a winter Monday night sometime in January or February. And so as a result, there were a lot of complaints about this, and that was another reason why a lot of people wanted to go to some sort of just flat out primary type system, regardless of when it was going to be held. But again, a bigger concern is also the notion of having some option for absentee or early voting, because some people wouldn't be able to get off work or get a babysitter for their kids, or just didn't want to go out on a dark winter night, whatever it happens to be. And so the Democrats tried to do some alternatives to that in 2020, but didn't seem to be overly successful. And so they'll probably stick with some type of mail-in voting, particularly if it turns out that they get a fairly good turnout for this. Now, again, the turnout would normally be fairly low when you have an incumbent in your particular caucus, as Biden is this time for the Democrats. But if they get a fairly good turnout, despite it being an incumbent, that maybe they'll say, okay, this is going to work. We'll, try to tweak it here and there. But they'll probably stick with this procedure at least through 2028.
Let's switch over to the Republicans. There's a lot happening. We have endorsements galore, it feels like. Obviously, the big one was Kim Reynolds endorsing DeSantis, but now we have former Congressman Steve King endorsing Vivek Ramaswamy, which, as we know, Steve King sat in his seat for almost 20 years, I believe, and then he got voted out after some questionable comments. Now, what do you think this endorsement does for Vivek? Does it do much for him?
I'm not sure that it does much for Vivek. Again, given that King was lost heavily in the primary, and he had been under attack pretty severely a couple of cycles before that for comments that he had made and so forth, and Republicans had basically had enough, and eventually King lost in the primary to current member of Congress Feenstra. And so I'm not sure that King carries a whole lot of weight. Now, there may be a certain segment of Republican voters that still like him, like what he said, maybe didn't like everything he said, but generally like his conservative stance. I'm not sure that that really aligns all that well with what Vivek Ramaswamy is talking about in various ways. And some of the things that Vivek has said also are kind of off the charts in terms of, well, we're going to get rid of 75% of the federal government. That's just not going to work, or it's going to pie in the sky types of things. But sort of Vivek's Ramaswamy's style is very, very energetic, throws out these sort of very grandiose types of things that he wants to do, but he's not going to be the nominee. He's polling low, and he's got a certain amount of support, but it's still very low, seemingly mid-single digits, if that. So it's just sort of something that maybe Ramaswamy can emphasize. A few people maybe vote for, but it's not going to have a major effect.
So, what are we going to see these next 10-ish days as we lead up to the caucuses? I mean, I've got my scheduler booked of all events, but what is the nation going to see from Iowa?
Well, as far as what the nation is going to see is we'll probably see plenty of clips of people, of the candidates that are in their final town halls, making their closing arguments. There are going to be advertisements. Now, nation may not see all the advertisements, but we'll see plenty of them here in Iowa. We're going to get lots of mailers, both pro and con for the various candidates, because they're in, as I said, that particular sprint to the finish. They've got to make those closing arguments to convince the voters to either switch to them if there are still some people that are persuadable, which there usually are at this point, but also to make sure that their supporters that they have identified know where their precinct caucus is going to be, and to make sure that they get out. So you want to keep your base energized and enthusiastic about your candidacy. So hopefully some positive messages and some strong points are going to be had. We're going to see some town halls that are broadcast on CNN and perhaps on some other stations and media outlets as well. Fox News, I think, has one of Town Hall of Trump. Some podcasters going to have one of Ramaswamy. Then, of course, the CNN debate is going to be on the 10th between DeSantis and Haley. And they're still trying to get maybe Trump to participate, although again, Trump's already scheduled an alternative town hall on Fox News the same night. So that's probably not going to happen. We're going to see again these candidates making that last pitch to energize their supporters, maybe convince some additional people as we roll into caucus night.
I've been stealing my coworker Brittany Lewis's question to round out our interviews. But what do you think is missing from the national conversation about the Iowa caucuses?
Well, that's kind of a hard question since I'm here in Iowa, so I'm seeing lots of things. I'm not always seeing how it's portrayed nationally, but basically, you have a situation where maybe some people don't understand the caucuses and sort of what the importance is. And that's kind of a traditional thing that goes on every cycle, just because the caucuses are different than a primary. And of course, the key difference is that you do have to show up to participate. Again, this is the way the Republicans traditionally are doing it. Democrats are doing something different this time with their mail-in ballot. But again, the traditional method is unlike a primary where you can vote anytime during the day, the primary day that the polls are open, or even earlier absentee vote. You can't do that with a caucus, but the caucuses are much more than that. It's always a process of having the candidates come in, meet the players in the state, the political players, but the activists, the volunteers, getting them sufficiently organized that you have a good ground game where you've got precinct captains in some 1,700 precincts across the state. And that means getting people energized, and those precinct captains then have to energize perhaps the voters in their particular precinct. If you've got a good person, that's your captain. So it's not just a matter of saying, giving a 3-minute speech on caucus night, and that makes you the captain. You've got to do this other work as well. And some campaigns have been a little bit better about getting those precinct captains on board early and getting them to help out and volunteer and help set up events, and getting their supporters in the precinct to be aware of those events and turning out for them and getting commitment cards and all these sorts of stuff. And all this work is part of that ground game that goes into a successful caucus. And so we've seen the candidates in their campaigns at different stages of this process. DeSantis has been pretty good. Haley started slow, but is sort of picking up steam a little bit. The Trump campaign really didn't emphasize that, particularly in 2016, and they sort of learned their lesson because they got beat by Cruz, who had a better ground game. And so they're working to try to have a better ground game this time. Although I've heard various reports sometimes that it's good, better than DeSantis, sometimes not. And really, the test is caucus night. What happens on that particular night? We often see a lot of movement, even very late. So even though to the extent that Trump seems to be pretty well locked in with, especially according to the polls, a 30+ point lead over DeSantis and Haley, that's probably going to shrink a little bit by caucus night as people make up their final mind. And again, assuming that they decide to actually turn out, which is going to be important for a variety of reasons, not least of which is the weather.
Well, we'll have to keep an eye on the weather, and we'll have to check back in with you as we get closer. Professor Tim Hagle, thank you so much for your time.
Very welcome.